What if you lived in a time when an unseen enemy could sweep through your city, wiping out half your neighbors in mere weeks? When a cough or a fever could signal the start of a terrifying countdown? From the 11th century to the 15th century, this was the chilling reality for millions. Number 11. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine, born around 1122, was not just a queen. She was a force of nature. She was Duchess of Aquitaine, in her own right Queen of France, and then Queen of England. Her life spanned over 80 years, a truly remarkable feat in the medieval world, especially one regularly rocked by disease. While the Black Death was still centuries away from its devastating arrival, the medieval period was no stranger to sickness. Localized epidemics of dysentery, smallpox, measles, and various fevers were constant threats, capable of decimating communities. Eleanor's early life saw her as a powerful heiress, married to Louis VII of France. She embarked on the Second Crusade with him, a journey fraught with dangers beyond just battle. Campaigns, especially those involving large groups of people living in close quarters with poor sanitation, were breeding grounds for disease. Historical accounts suggest that many crusaders succumbed to illness during these long, arduous journeys, not just enemy swords. For Eleanor to survive such a venture, traveling through vast territories and facing new climates and pathogens, speaks to an incredible resilience, or perhaps a very strong immune system. She returned from the crusade, divorced Louis, and then married Henry Plantagenet, who would become King Henry II of England. As Queen of England, Eleanor was constantly on the move. She traveled between England and her vast French territories, presiding over courts, managing her lands, and raising her children, including the future King Richard the Lionheart and King John. Each journey, each new city, each gathering presented a fresh opportunity for exposure to illness. Medieval cities, even royal palaces, were far from sanitary. Open sewers, close living quarters, and a lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that epidemics could spread like wildfire once they took hold. Despite these prevailing conditions, Eleanor continued to thrive. Her resilience was put to the test multiple times. After her son, Henry the young king, rebelled against her husband, Eleanor was imprisoned by Henry II for many years, mostly at Winchester Castle or Salisbury. Even within the confines of a castle, the threat of disease was ever present. Chronicles from the time often mention periods of great sickness or pestilence affecting various parts of England. For instance, the Pipe Rolls, which recorded royal expenditures, sometimes noted payments for efforts to mitigate illness or for burials of those who died during outbreak. Yet, Eleanor endured her long years of captivity, a period that would have weakened many others, and emerged to play a crucial role in her son's reigns, particularly after Henry II's death. She outlived many of her children, a tragic commonality in the medieval era. Her son Richard the Lionheart died in 1199 from a wound, not disease. But his life was filled with exposure to illness during his crusades and imprisonment. Eleanor, at an advanced age for the time, personally traveled to Spain to arrange the marriage of her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, to Louis VIII of France. This was not a short or easy trip, especially for someone in her late 70s. It was a testament to her enduring strength and vitality, navigating a world where disease was an invisible, constant predator. Her continued involvement in state affairs, her extensive travels, and her remarkably long life all occurred against a backdrop of recurrent, deadly, medieval epidemics, a reality she navigated with astonishing fortitude until her death in 1204. Number 10. Blanche of Castile. Blanche of Castile, born in 1188, stepped into the formidable shoes of her grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, when she became Queen of France as the wife of Louis VIII, and then, even more significantly, as regent for her young son, Louis IX. The early 13th century, like all medieval periods, was a time when populations were highly vulnerable to disease. While the massive waves of the Black Death were still some time away. Regional epidemics of dysentery, fevers, and other infectious diseases were a regular occurrence. Blanche's life began with a long journey from Castile in Spain to France, a perilous undertaking in itself, exposing her to new environments and potential pathogens. As queen, she would have resided in various royal residences, from the bustling Palais de la Cité in Paris to the more secluded castles in the Loire Valley. Each location, with its own conditions and population density, presented a risk of disease. Royal households, though seemingly privileged, were not immune. They were often large, with many servants, knights, and courtiers living in close proximity, making them susceptible to rapid disease transmission. During her regency, which began in 1226, after the sudden death of her husband, Louis VIII, Blanche faced numerous political challenges. She navigated rebellions from powerful barons, dealt with the ongoing Albigensian Crusade, and worked tirelessly to secure her son's position. This period of intense stress and constant activity could easily have taken a toll on her health, yet she maintained her vigor, a trait essential for effective medieval rule. Chroniclers like Matthew Paris, though English, often provided insights into the general conditions across Europe, frequently mentioning outbreaks of sickness that affected populations, including the nobility. One significant period of concern for Blanche would have been the preparation and execution of the Seventh Crusade led by her son, Louis IX. While Louis himself became very ill during this campaign, Blanche remained in France, acting as regent once more. Her role would have involved managing the kingdom, which included dealing with the indirect consequences of disease. For instance, if large numbers of peasants or soldiers fell ill, it would impact the economy, agricultural output, and military readiness. Blanche's administrative skills would have extended to managing these crises, ensuring the well-being of the realm's population as much as possible, even in the face of widespread sickness. Blanche's personal survival through a period marked by recurrent, localized epidemics stands out. She lived until 1252, reaching the age of 63. This was a respectable age for the 13th century, particularly for someone who bore children and lived under immense political pressure. Her longevity amidst the constant threat of medieval diseases speaks to her general health, and perhaps the care she received, even if the understanding of hygiene was limited. Royal physicians, while not possessing modern medical knowledge, did practice some forms of care which might have included dietary advice or herbal remedies that could have offered some palliative relief. Her ability to weather the storms of both political intrigue and pervasive disease allowed her to solidify her son's rule and leave a lasting legacy for France. Number 9. Margaret of France. Margaret of France, born around 1279, became Queen of England as the second wife of King Edward I. Her life unfolded at the cusp of the 14th century, a time that saw significant environment and demographic shifts, often leading to widespread hardship and disease. While the catastrophic Black Death was still a few decades away, the first half of the 14th century was plagued by a series of severe famines, notably the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Famine, by weakening populations through malnutrition, created fertile ground for epidemics to flourish, even of common diseases like influenza or dysentery, turning them into deadly outbreaks. Margaret arrived in England in 1299 for her marriage, a union that was meant to solidify peace between England and France. She would have traveled through populated areas where the risk of encountering illness was ever present. As queen, she would have resided in various royal palaces from Westminster to Windsor. Royal records from the period, such as household accounts, occasionally documented the presence of illness among the court, or payments made for medical care, or for the burial of those who died. However, specific details about Margaret's personal health during these times are scarce, which itself can be a sign of her general well-being. Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was a period of immense suffering. Across northern Europe, including England, crop failures caused by unusually heavy rains led to food shortages and soaring prices. This widespread hunger undoubtedly weakened the population's immunity, making them more susceptible to disease. The period immediately following the famine saw a surge in mortality, often attributed to dysentery and other illnesses that spread easily among a malnourished populace. The annalist Paulini, a chronicle from St. Paul's Cathedral, London, noted the extreme hardship and deaths during this period. Margaret, though royalty, would have been acutely aware of the suffering, and the royal household would have had to manage the logistical challenges of securing food and maintaining order amid such widespread. Margaret gave birth to two sons, Thomas and Edmund, within a few years of her marriage. Childbirth was a major cause of death for medieval women, even queens. Her successful pregnancies and her survival of the post-famine epidemic period speak to her resilience. Edward I, her husband, was much older than her and died in 1307, leaving Margaret a young widow at about 28 years old. Despite being a dowager queen, she chose to remain in England and dedicated herself to her children. She lived until 1318, dying at around the age of 39. While she did not reach an advanced age like some other queens, her survival through the challenging famine years and the subsequent waves of disease that swept through England in the early 14th century marks her as someone who endured significant epidemiological threats. Her relatively quiet but steadfast life, away from the direct political upheavals, allowed her to navigate these deadly times quietly but effectively, staying safe enough to live beyond the immediate devastating effects of one of England's worst environmental. Number 8. Isabella of France. Isabella of France, born around 1295, earned the dramatic nickname She-Wolf of France for her fierce political actions against her husband, King Edward II of England. Her life, much like Margaret's, unfolded during a particularly grim period of medieval history, leading right up to the doorstep of the Black Death itself. She not only lived through the Great Famine and its subsequent epidemics, but also survived long enough to witness the terrifying initial waves of the Great Pestilence that began sweeping across Europe in the mid-14th century. Isabella arrived in England in 1308 for her marriage to Edward II. Her early years as queen were marked by the political struggles surrounding Edward's favored companions. Like all medieval courts, her life was one of constant movement between royal residences, each presenting its own challenges for hygiene and disease control. Court often traveled with hundreds of people along with their animals and belongings, a perfect recipe for spreading any sickness that might arise. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 deeply impacted England. While Isabella, as queen, would have been shielded from the direct starvation suffered by the peasantry, the resulting epidemics of dysentery, typhus, and other diseases certainly would have affected the royal household and the wider population she governed. Many historical records, such as local court rolls and manorial accounts, mention widespread deaths during these years impacting all levels of society. Chronicon de l'Anarchost, for example, vividly described the widespread death among humans and animals due to the famine. Isabella's survival through this period of heightened mortality, where many of her subjects perished, indicates a certain robustness. Her journey to overthrow Edward II, which involved traveling to France, gathering an army, and invading England, was a monumental undertaking. Such military campaigns, particularly those involving large numbers of people living in close quarters and often in unsanitary conditions, were notorious for outbreaks of disease. Soldiers frequently died more from sickness than from battle wounds. For Isabella to lead such an endeavor, travel with her son, the future Edward III, and succeed suggests she maintained her health and vigor even during extreme stress and exposure. After her political triumph and her son's ascension to the throne, Isabella experienced a period of effective rule alongside her lover Roger Mortimer. However, her influence waned, and she was eventually placed under house arrest at Castle Rising, though she was allowed a comfortable life. Even in this restricted environment, the omnipresent threat of disease persisted. It was during these later years that the Black Death arrived in Europe. The Black Death reached England in 1348. This was a truly unprecedented event, killing an estimated 30 to 50% of the population in its first wave. Isabella was alive during this period. The Black Death was indiscriminate, claiming lives from all social classes including royalty. For instance, her daughter Joan, who was traveling to marry Pedro of Castile, died of the plague in Bordeaux in 1348. This loss would have brought the horrific reality of the plague directly to Isabella's family. While many other members of the royal family and nobility succumbed to the disease, Isabella, living in her relatively comfortable but not entirely isolated confinement, survived the initial and subsequent waves of the plague. She lived until 1358, dying at the age of 63. Her survival through the devastating onslaught of the Black Death, which claimed so many, makes her a remarkable example of resilience in the face of history's most terrifying pandemic. Number 7. Philippa of Hainaut. Philippa of Hainaut, born around 1314, married King Edward III of England and was queen for over 40 years. Her reign coincided almost perfectly with the arrival and first devastating wave of the Black Death in England, making her survival of this horrific pandemic one of the most striking examples of royal endurance during a period of unprecedented mortal endurance. Philippa came from Hainaut, a region that is now part of modern-day Belgium. Her journey to England for her marriage in 1328 would have taken her across busy trade routes and cities, exposing her to various local diseases. As queen, she was central to the English court, a bustling center of activity. The royal household, moving between palaces like Westminster, Windsor, and Eltham, carried with it a large retinue of people, making it highly susceptible to the spread of any infectious disease. The first major blow was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and the subsequent epidemics that preceded Philippa's arrival in England, but the lingering effects of malnutrition and weakened populations certainly made the ground fertile for future scourges. Philippa saw her country recover somewhat only to face the ultimate challenge, the Black Death. The plague reached England in 1348, entering through port towns like Melcombe Regis in Dorset. From there, it spread rapidly, decimating communities across the country. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence paint a grim picture of the plague's impact. Monasteries, often well documented, lost huge numbers of monks and nuns. Villagers died en masse, sometimes leaving entire settlements abandoned. The royal court was not immune. Many members of the nobility, including close relatives and servants of the royal family, died. For example, records show that the royal household was significantly disrupted. The sheer scale of death meant that ordinary life was severely impacted, from the functioning of government to the availability of basic services. Chronicles, like the Chronicon de Melsa or Henry Knighton's chronicle, vividly describe the horror and widespread death during the first plague wave. What actions did Philippa take? Like many who could afford it, the royal family often tried to escape the plague by moving from one residence to another, often to more rural or isolated locations, hoping to outrun the disease. For example, during the plague, it was common for the court to retreat to places like Windsor Castle, a more enclosed and perhaps healthier environment away from the density of London. While they didn't understand germ theory, they intuitively recognized that crowds and unsanitary conditions were dangerous. The royal household accounts might show increased expenses for cleaning or for purchases of aromatic herbs, which were believed to ward off bad air, miasma, thought to be the cause of disease. Philippa's most famous act of compassion during the Black Death's aftermath is often cited in relation to the siege of Calais, but her constant presence and support for Edward III during this time of national trauma was significant. She bore Edward III 14 children, a remarkable number for the period, and many of them unfortunately died young, though not necessarily always from plague. However, the fact that she gave birth to so many children and continued to govern and support her husband during such a period of national crisis pose her resilience and continued help. Philippa lived until 1369, surviving the first major wave of the Black Death and witnessing subsequent, though less severe, outbreaks. Her death at the age of 55 was due to dropsy, not plague. Her long life as queen during a period of such profound demographic change and suffering is a testament to her endurance and perhaps some degree of innate immunity or effective management of her environment, allowing her to stand as a beacon of survival in a kingdom devastated by the ultimate medieval plague. Number 6. Joanna of Navarre. Joanna of Navarre, born around 1368, became Queen of England as the second wife of King Henry IV. Her life, spanning from the late 14th century into the early 15th century, was characterized by the ongoing presence of the plague. The Black Death had made its initial devastating sweep in 1348 to 1349, but it did not vanish. Instead, it became an endemic disease returning in cycles of varying intensity every few years or decades. Joanna, therefore, lived through a period of recurrent plague outbreaks, constantly aware of the invisible threat that could strike at any time. Joanna's early life was in Brittany, a duchy with strong maritime connections, making it susceptible to disease spread through trade. She first married John IV, Duke of Brittany, and bore him numerous children. As Duchess, she would have been responsible for managing her household and lands, duties that would have brought her into contact with the realities of disease within her own population. Records from various towns and regions during this period often mention localized outbreaks, sometimes referred to as the pestilence, which caused significant mortality. The Chronicle of Froissart, a comprehensive account of the 100 Years' War, often includes observations about the impact of disease on armies and populations. After her first husband's death, Joanna remarried King Henry IV of England in 1403. Her transition to the English court meant adapting to a new environment, albeit one that shared similar challenges regarding public health. As queen, she would have been central to royal life, moving between the palaces of Windsor, Westminster, and Eltham. Royal households were often large and transient, making them susceptible to the spread of illness. The royal accounts and household ordinances from the period reveal efforts to maintain some level of cleanliness, though these were often rudimentary by modern standards. During Joanna's time as queen, major outbreaks of the plague occurred in England. For example, a significant plague wave hit London and other parts of England in 1405 to 1406, causing a high death toll. Many individuals of status and wealth, including members of the clergy and gentry, were recorded as dying during these outbreaks. While detailed accounts of the Queen's specific actions are not always available, it is plausible that she, like her predecessors, would have retreated from areas of high infection. Court would move to less populated areas, effectively quarantining itself as best it could, though the understanding of airborne or flea-borne transmission was non-existent. Joanna also faced political challenges, notably later in her life when she was accused of witchcraft by her stepson Henry V and imprisoned at Pevensey Castle. Her imprisonment, while harsh, may have paradoxically offered some protection from the broader epidemics, as she was in a more controlled, isolated environment. However, any enclosed space still carried risks. She was released in 1425, long after Henry V's death, and lived out her remaining years in comfort. Joanna of Navarre lived until 1437, reaching the respectable age of 69. Her long life saw her navigate both the political intrigues of the English court. She outlived both her husbands and many of her contemporaries who succumbed to the various waves of the Great Pestilence. Her survival through a period where recurrent plague outbreaks were simply a fact, harming thousands with each return, highlights her personal resilience and perhaps some luck in avoiding Pax Comain MacNear. Number 5. Catherine of Valois. Catherine of Valois, born in 1401, was the daughter of King Charles VI of France and became Queen of England as the wife of King Henry V. Her life unfolded during the ongoing 100 Years' War, a conflict that, while defined by battles, also brought with it the constant threat of disease. Armies on the move, sieges, and the widespread disruption of society all contributed to conditions ripe for the spread of epidemics, including recurrent outbreaks of the plague and other illnesses, like dysentery and typhus. Catherine's early life in France was undoubtedly touched by the general instability and hardship caused by the war and the periodic return of disease. As a princess, her health would have been a matter of great concern for the French court, and she would have received the best medical attention available, though this was limited by medieval understanding. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 led to her marriage to Henry V. This union was meant to bring peace and unite the crowns of France and England. Upon her marriage and relocation to England, Catherine was thrust into the heart of the English court, which was itself regularly affected by disease. The royal household, always a large and transient body, was susceptible to outbreaks. During Catherine's time, there were significant plague outbreaks in England. For instance, London and other areas experienced a severe epidemic in 1421 to 1422. The London letter books and civic records from the time often note increased mortality and the disruption of normal life, such as the cancellation of events or the closure of markets due to the pestilence. Henry V was a campaigning king, constantly leading his armies in France. Military campaigns were hotbeds of disease, and soldiers often died from illness more than from battle. While Catherine did not accompany her husband on all his campaigns, she was part of the royal entourage that traveled with him to France in 1422. This journey and residence in a besieged or occupied city would have exposed her to high risks. Tragically, Henry V himself died in France in 1422, not in battle, but likely from dysentery, a common camp disease. This brought home the very real and immediate threat of disease to the royal family. Catherine was left a young widow with an infant son, the future King Henry VI. She then lived as a dowager queen, her influence diminishing as her son's regency council took power. She lived a more private life, eventually forming a relationship and secretly marrying Owen Tudor, a Welsh squire. This period of her life, while less politically prominent, still placed her in a world where disease was a constant threat. Her private residences would have still been subject to outbreaks, and her interaction with her growing family with Owen Tudor meant constant exposure to childhood illnesses as well. Catherine of Valois died in 1437 at the age of 35. While she did not live to an old age, her life was packed with upheaval and exposure to disease, including the death of her husband from an illness contracted on campaign. Her survival through the numerous plague outbreaks and other epidemics that characterized the first half of the 15th century, particularly given her prominent position and extensive travel, marks her as someone who navigated a perilous epidemiological landscape, ultimately succumbing to causes other than the widespread pestilence that claimed so many. Number 4. Margaret of Anjou. Margaret of Anjou, born in 1430, became Queen of England as the wife of King Henry VI. Her life was defined by the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict that tore England apart. But even amidst the battles and political intrigue, the ever-present threat of plague and other diseases continued to stalk the population, including royalty, Margaret lived through multiple waves of plague and other epidemics that ravaged England during the mid to late 15th century. Margaret's early life in Anjou, France, would have prepared her for the reality of medieval disease. By the time of her marriage to Henry VI in 1445, the plague was an established feature of life, having returned in cyclical outbreaks for decades. The English court, which Margaret now joined, was a microcosm of society, and even royalty was not immune. The Great Chronicle of London and other civic records frequently mention plague outbreaks, especially in London, which were often particularly severe due to the city's dense population and trade connections. These records would note periods of high mortality, sometimes leading to the closure of courts or the suspension of normal business. The Wars of the Roses beginning in the 1450s dramatically increased the risks of disease. Large armies moving across the country, often living in unsanitary camps, spread illnesses like dysentery and typhus. Sieges, a common feature of the war, led to overcrowding and poor hygiene within besieged towns, often resulting in devastating outbreaks among both the besieged and the besiegers. Margaret, as a central figure in the Lancastrian cause, was often on the move with her son Edward, Prince of Wales, traveling between strongholds and campaigning alongside her armies. Her survival through these military campaigns is notable. While specific records of her personal health during battles are scarce, the general mortality rate from disease in medieval armies was incredibly. To travel with such forces, often fleeing or pursuing, and to maintain her health, speaks to a strong constitution. For instance, in 1461, after the Second Battle of St. Albans, Margaret and her army moved south towards London, a city frequently hit by plague. While Londoners feared her army, they also feared the potential spread of disease that such a large transient force could bring. After the Lancastrian defeat at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, where her son Edward was killed, Margaret was captured and imprisoned. She spent several years in various English castles, including the Tower of London. While imprisonment might offer some isolation, medieval prisons were often dark, damp, and unsanitary places, making prisoners highly vulnerable to disease. Yet Margaret endured her confinement, outliving many of her political adversaries and contemporaries who perished from various causes, including illness. Margaret of Anjou was eventually ransomed by Louis XI of France in 1475 and lived out her remaining years in France. She died in 1482 at the age of 52. Her life was a testament to her resilience, not just against political and military threats, but also against the unseen enemy of disease. Her prolonged survival through multiple plague waves and the highly unsanitary conditions associated with constant warfare, where disease was as deadly as any weapon, showcase her remarkable ability to endure in a world perpetually threatened by invisible killers. Number 3. Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville, born around 1437, rose from relatively humble origins to become Queen of England as the wife of King Edward IV. Her life was steeped in the turbulent Wars of the Roses, a conflict that, while dominated by battles, also constantly played out against the backdrop of recurrent plague outbreaks and other deadly diseases. Elizabeth's reign and later life were characterized by intense political upheaval and the ever-present threat of pestilence. Elizabeth's early life in the English gentry would have exposed her to the common illnesses of the time. Her family would have lived in a world where childhood diseases, seasonal fevers, and the periodic return of the plague were facts of life. When she secretly married Edward IV in 1464, she gained access to the royal court, a place of privilege but not immunity from disease. The royal household, with its large staff and constant movement between palaces, was always at risk. The Westminster Abbey, muniments, and other London records from this period frequently died deaths in the city, sometimes forcing the king and court to leave London for safer, more rural residences, like Eltham or Windsor. Elizabeth gave birth to 10 children with Edward IV, a remarkable feat in an era of high infant and child mortality, where many succumbed to common diseases like measles, smallpox, or dysentery. Her successful pregnancies and the number of her children who survived into adulthood, though tragically her sons, the princes in the Tower, disappeared, indicates a strong personal health and perhaps careful management of her children's early lives, as much as was possible. During her time as queen, especially during periods of Lancastrian resurgence, Elizabeth faced great personal danger and stress. For instance, in 1470, when Edward IV was briefly deposed by Warwick and Margaret of Anjou, Elizabeth sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her daughters. Living in the confined, often crowded conditions of a sanctuary, even a religious one, carried its own health risks due to the concentration of people. Yet she survived this period, and her husband eventually regained his throne. After Edward IV's death in 1483, Elizabeth's life spiraled into tragedy and uncertainty, with the disappearance of her sons and the usurpation of the throne by Richard III. She again sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, a stark example of a queen stripped of power but still fighting for her family's survival. Her time in sanctuary was prolonged, and these were periods where disease could easily spread, especially with the added stress of political upheaval and fear. The records of the time show how quickly illnesses could take hold in crowded conditions. Elizabeth eventually retired to Bermondsey Abbey, where she lived out her final years. Her survival through the intense political turmoil of the Wars of the Roses, where many of her family and allies were killed either in battle or through political executions, as well as her endurance of the various plague outbreaks that continued to menace England, is a testament to her strength. Elizabeth Woodville died in 1492 at the age of 55, a respectable age for the era. Her life was a complex tapestry of fortune and misfortune, but throughout it all she navigated a world where deadly plagues were a recurrent threat, emerging as a survivor despite the odds. Number 2. Isabella I of Castile. Isabella I of Castile, born in 1451, was one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, whose reign marked the transition from the medieval to the early modern period in Spain. Her life, much like her kingdom, was frequently affected by outbreaks of plague and other infectious diseases. Spain, with its extensive trade routes and bustling cities, was no stranger to the returning waves of the Black Death and other epidemics that continued to claim lives well into the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Isabella's early life was marked by political instability within Castile, culminating in her struggle for the throne against her niece Joanna la Beltranea. During these formative years, she would have witnessed the impact of disease on the populace. The Iberian Peninsula, being a crossroads of trade and cultural exchange, was particularly vulnerable to imported diseases. Royal chronicles and municipal records from cities like Seville, Toledo, and Valencia often recorded periods of pestilence or great sickness that caused significant mortality and disrupted economic and social life. After securing her throne and marrying Ferdinand II of Aragon, Isabella embarked on a monumental task: the unification of Spain, most notably through the conquest of Granada, the last Moorish stronghold. The Granada War, 1482 to 1492, was a protracted conflict that spanned a decade. Wars, especially long sieges and campaigns, were notorious for disease outbreaks. Armies, living in close quarters with poor sanitation, were breeding grounds for dysentery, typhus, and other infectious illnesses. It was common for more soldiers to die from disease than from battle wounds. Isabella, despite being a monarch, was often present near the front lines, personally involved in the logistics and morale of her troops. Her presence in camps and her constant travel across her kingdom during the war would have exposed her to numerous health risks. For example, during the Siege of Baza, 1489, a particularly grueling and extended siege, Both the besieging Castilian forces and the defenders suffered immensely from disease and hunger. Isabella's direct involvement, providing supplies and comfort to her troops, placed her in a high-risk environment. That she emerged from this decade of intense warfare in good health, leading a successful conquest, is a testament to her robust constitution and meticulous management of her own health. Isabella was also a patron of exploration, most famously sponsoring Christopher Columbus's voyages. The age of exploration, while opening up new worlds, also brought new diseases and intensified the spread of existing ones. Sailors on long voyages were highly susceptible to scurvy and other illnesses, and the return of ships to port could introduce new pathogens to the population. While Isabella herself did not travel overseas, her kingdom was at the heart of this global exchange, constantly facing the reintroduction of disease. Isabella I died in 1504 at the age of 53. A respectable age for the late 15th century. Her death was reportedly due to dropsy and chronic illness, not an acute epidemic. Her long and incredibly active life, marked by warfare, extensive travel, and the immense responsibilities of governance, all occurred in an era where plague and other deadly diseases were a constant threat. Her survival through these numerous outbreaks, even while deeply involved in physically demanding campaigns, solidifies her place as a powerful queen who defied the odds of medieval mortality. Number 1. Anne of Brittany. Anne of Brittany, born in 1477, was the only Duchess of Brittany to rule in her own right, and she became Queen of France twice, first as the wife of King Charles VIII and then of King Louis XII. Her life spanned the late 15th and early 16th centuries, a period that saw the tail end of the medieval plague era, but also the emergence of new diseases and the continuation of old ones. Anne's constant efforts to protect her beloved Brittany's independence were intertwined with her own survival in a world still frequently ravaged by epidemics. Anne inherited the Duchy of Brittany at a young age, a territory known for its strong independent spirit. As Duchess, she was responsible for her lands and people duties that would have brought her into direct contact with the health challenges faced by her subjects. Brittany, with its extensive coastline and maritime trade, was constantly vulnerable to diseases arriving by sea. Local chronicles and town records from various parts of France and Brittany during her lifetime frequently mention outbreaks of pestilence, often accompanied by high mortality rates. These were recurrent waves of what we now understand to be the plague, as well as other common diseases like influenza or typhus. Anne's marriages to two successive French kings were designed to integrate Brittany into France. Her first marriage to Charles VIII in 1491 thrust her into the heart of the French court, a large and active environment. King Charles VIII led the first of the Italian wars, campaigning extensively. While Anne did not accompany him on these military expeditions, the movement of armies and the constant interaction between France and other parts of Europe through these wars meant a heightened risk of disease spread within the kingdom. For instance, the infamous French disease, later identified as syphilis, made its first major appearance in Europe during these Italian wars, spreading rapidly among soldiers and then into the general population. After Charles VIII's death in 1498, Anne married his successor, Louis XII, in 1499. This second marriage also involved living at the French court, which, despite its grandeur, was still prone to outbreaks. Royal physicians, while educated, lacked modern understanding of disease transmission, so prevention was largely based on isolation and attempts at purifying the air with perfumes and fires. Anne herself gave birth to numerous children, but many did not survive infancy, a common tragedy in the medieval and early modern periods due to childhood diseases. Anne's life was also marked by a strong sense of devotion to her duchy and its people. She traveled extensively within France, visiting various castles and managing her affairs. Each journey, each stay in a new city or castle carried the risk of encountering illness. Her household, consisting of hundreds of individuals, was a large epidemiological unit constantly susceptible to any illness that might be circulating. Accounts from the period often describe how outbreaks would force the court to relocate frequently to avoid infection. Anne of Brittany died in 1514 at the age of 36, reportedly from kidney stones. While her life was relatively short, her survival through the numerous and recurrent plague outbreaks that continued to affect Europe into the early 16th century, alongside the new threats posed by diseases like syphilis spreading across the continent. As a powerful duchess and queen, navigating a politically complex and epidemiologically dangerous world, Anne of Brittany stands as a final testament to the resilience of medieval queens in the face of deadly, unseen enemy.